Have you ever felt that pull in your heart for someone, like picturing a future with them and wondered if prayer could be a part of that journey?
It's a question a lot of people ask, how do you pray for something as personal as finding a spouse?
Well, today we're going to take a deep dive into a prayer that's specifically designed to help people navigate that question.
Yeah, it's fascinating how this prayer approaches the whole idea of marriage. It doesn't just jump right into asking for a spouse. It really lays a foundation first.
Right. It starts with acknowledging God's goodness, regardless of whether you're in a relationship or not.
Exactly. And I think that's really significant. It's like setting the tone from the get-go.
So what's the significance of that?
Well, it's like saying, God, I trust in your goodness and your plan for me, whether I'm single or married.
It's not about dictating terms, right?
Yeah, it's about approaching this desire for love with a sense of humility.
So it's less about getting what we want and more about aligning our desires with God's bigger picture.
Precisely. And that leads to the next point, praying with the right motives.
Yeah, the prayer emphasizes asking in faith, not just out of selfish desires, but with a heart that's seeking to bring glory to God.
I think that raises a big question, though, how do we decipher those right motives?
Right. How do we know if what we're praying for is truly aligned with God's will, especially when it comes to something as personal as finding a spouse?
Well, there are different theological interpretations out there, but a common thread is the importance of seeking God's guidance.
So it's about asking God, is this relationship part of your plan for me? And being open to whatever the answer is.
Exactly. And sometimes that answer might not be what we initially hoped for.
So it's about being willing to let go of our own expectations and surrender to God's plan.
Yeah, and that leads to another really crucial aspect, recognizing that marriage, as it's presented in this prayer, is seen as a reflection of God's love.
It highlights marriage as something good that God created, reflecting his love for the church.
It's not just about finding someone to make you happy, it's tied to a much deeper spiritual truth.
So the prayer elevates marriage beyond just personal fulfillment. It connects it to this larger spiritual purpose.
Right, and I think that has a big impact on how we approach finding a partner.
So how would you say that impacts our approach?
Well, it calls us to look beyond just superficial qualities.
Like looks or social status?
It's about seeking someone who shares your faith and values.
Someone who will support your spiritual growth and journey with you on that path.
Exactly. And that brings us to a point that can be pretty challenging, submitting to God's timing.
Yeah, the prayer asks for guidance and clarity on the path to marriage, while also acknowledging that God's timing is perfect.
And that's a tough one for a lot of people.
I think it's so easy to get caught up in our own timelines. We have these expectations of when things should happen.
Right, and if things don't move at the pace we expect, we can start to feel anxious or discouraged.
So how do we reconcile that deep longing for a partner with the surrender to God's timing?
It's a delicate balance, it's like a dance between desire and surrender.
How do we navigate that tension?
We bring our longing to God and we acknowledge it and then trust that He's, weaving it into His perfect plan.
Yeah, and sometimes that means waiting, which can be really hard.
It can be, but, I've heard people say that God's delays are not God's denials.
I've heard that too, and I think that's such an important reminder.
It is, because those waiting periods, even though they're difficult, can be profoundly transformative.
In what way?
Well, they can be times of deepening our faith, learning to rely on God more fully and really preparing ourselves for the blessings that He has in store for us.
So it's not about passive resignation, but actively using that time to grow closer to God.
Exactly, and that growth often involves taking an honest look inward, which is where the element of repentance comes in.
Yeah, this prayer encourages us to reflect and ask, are there any areas in my life that might be hindering me from receiving this blessing?
Right, and that can be a tough question to grapple with.
Yeah, it's like we're being asked to examine our own hearts, maybe even confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
It does require humility, and a willingness to let God shine a light on areas where we need to grow.
So what are some of those areas that we might need to examine?
Well, it could be things like bitterness, unforgiveness, or maybe even unrealistic expectations, things that could be blocking us from experiencing healthy relationships.
It's about clearing the ground and making space for God to work in our lives.
And preparing us for the relationship that He desires for us. And it's not just about internal work,
What else is there?
It's also about taking responsibility for our actions.
So it's not enough to just sit back and wait for a spouse to magically appear.
Right. We need to be actively engaging in healthy ways to meet people, putting ourselves out there and trusting God to guide our steps.
So it's about finding that balance between effort and surrender.
Exactly. We do our part, but we also recognize that ultimately God is the one who orchestrates the connections
And brings people into our lives. But in the midst of all this, it's so important to remember that our identity and worth are not determined by our relationship status.
That's a crucial point. Whether we're single or married, our primary relationship should be with God.
He's the one who truly completes us.
He's the source of our wholeness, our purpose, our joy, and when we find that security and contentment in Him, it changes how we approach this desire for marriage.
So it's not about desperately searching for someone to fill a void.
No, it becomes a desire to share our lives with someone who will join us on this journey of faith.
It's about approaching marriage from a place of wholeness, not lack.
Exactly, and this prayer, with its emphasis on seeking a godly spouse, really underscores that point.
It's not just about finding someone who checks off our personal preference list.
Right, it's about finding someone whose heart is aligned with God's.
So how do we discern those qualities in someone? How do we know if the person we're drawn to is truly a godly spouse?
Well, it's about looking beyond the surface and really observing how they live their lives.
Like, what are their actions saying?
Yeah. How do they treat others? What are their priorities? Do they exhibit those fruits of the Spirit,
Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control.
Exactly those. Do they prioritize their relationship with God?
So it's about observing their character and seeing if their values align with the principles of faith.
Yes. And it's also about seeking wise counsel,
From people we trust.
Yeah, people who can offer an objective perspective and help us see things that we might be missing.
Sometimes we can get so caught up in our own feelings that we need that outside perspective to help us discern wisely.
Absolutely. And in the midst of all this, we need to remember that ultimately, God is the one who knows our hearts better than we know ourselves.
He sees the bigger picture.
And He desires to guide us towards relationships that will bring Him glory and contribute to our growth and fulfillment.
So it's a combination of seeking wisdom, observing carefully, and trusting in God's guidance.
Precisely. And that brings us back to the overarching theme of this prayer surrender.
Letting go of our need to control everything.
Acknowledging our desires, seeking God's will, and then trusting that He's working things out for our good, even when we can't see the full picture.
But that can be hard, especially when we're so invested in finding a partner. It's easy to get anxious or discouraged when the answer isn't clear.
It is, and that's why I think the opening line of this prayer is so important. God, you are good.
It's a powerful reminder.
No matter what our relationship status is, no matter what our circumstances are, that truth remains constant.
Our ultimate source of comfort, peace, and fulfillment is found in God.
And His goodness transcends any earthly relationship. And from that place of security, we can approach the desire for marriage with a sense of peace and hope.
Knowing that God is for us, He loves us, and He's working all things together for our good.
And that trust allows us to experience a level of freedom and peace that transcends our circumstances.
We can release our grip on the outcome and just embrace the journey.
Knowing that God is with us every step of the way.
Yeah, it's like we're saying, God, this really mattered to me, but you matter even more. Show me how this fits into your plan for my life.
It's not about pretending the desire isn't there, It's about surrendering it to something bigger than ourselves.
Like saying, God, I trust you to write a better love story than I ever could.
Exactly. And this whole conversation has really got me thinking this prayer, it's not just about finding a spouse, is it?
Yeah, I was thinking that too. It seems like it applies to so many areas of life,
It does. These principles of trust and surrender and seeking God's guidance, they're relevant to all kinds of desires.
Like whether it's finding a partner or changing careers or even healing from past hurts.
Exactly. We can approach all of those things with the same spirit of faith and surrender.
So it's not just a guide on how to get married. It's a deeper invitation to align our hearts with God's will.
And that's what makes this prayer so powerful. It's not a magic formula. It's a path to true fulfillment.
Because ultimately our joy comes from God, not from our circumstances.
Exactly. And when we realize that it takes the pressure off, we can stop trying to control everything and just embrace the journey.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. As we wrap up, is there one key takeaway you hope listeners will walk away with?
Well, I hope they'll remember that God cares about their desires. He wants to use those desires to draw them closer to Him.
And to weed those desires into His plan for their lives. And I hope they'll be encouraged to approach those desires with a sense of trust, surrender, and a willingness to let God lead.
Because sometimes His plan is even more amazing than anything we could have imagined.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the power of prayer, and we'll see you next time.